Hey everybody, welcome back. I don't know if you'll hear any purring, but I've got a cat right next to me, which is very exciting. So Midnight is right here. I'll make sure I post a picture of her. So today we're going to talk about the history of variety. Um, it is a complicated history. We'll be talking about minstrelsy and blackface. We'll be talking about vaudeville. We'll be talking about some really random stuff that became super popular. Um, and that it kind of predicts some of the entertainment we have today. So, some minstrelsy was not blackface, but most of the way we talk about it, it is. Um, I mean, if you think about it, like minstrel singers, it used to just mean singers. And, like, if you were in Italy in 1600 and you heard wandering minstrels singing, it would probably just be Italian guys. But roughly from the 1840s through the 1900s, in terms of the high point, quote unquote high point, or low point, really, when you think about it, is what we're talking about here. It's To be generous, it's the earliest variety show type to make a lasting impact on American culture. We still see it today. Um, as with vaudeville, audience driven, meaning if something is entertaining to the audience, it's likely to be included and to remain in the show. If it is not appealing to the audience, it will not. As opposed to something that's writer driven, actor driven, etc. Who's driving the car? Um, it was loosely scripted, if at all, and you would have white actors wearing blackface playing a series of imagined Southern black characters. Black actors sometimes performed, but also had to wear blackface. And there is a link that I have posted of that's one of those JSTOR Today essays about when black actors wore blackface. So definitely do a deep dive into that if you are interested. If that is too much, I totally understand. Jim Crow was originally the name of a minstrel show character. Um, and I think he sang a song that was called Jump Jim Crow. Other works that came from the minstrelsy culture include, if you've ever heard the song from Disney, Zippity Doo Dah, that's from minstrelsy, and the ride Splash Mountain, which came from Song of the South. There's a lot of influence there. The Virginia Minstrels were a famous blackface quartet from the 1840s. They sang that song Dixie, which, we live in the South. You can certainly look it up if you haven't heard it already. We talked about the intense popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin during and after the Civil War, but these shows were popular too, with more racist caricatures. So it's interesting to see that both were coexisting. Um, there was lots of corporate sponsorship well into the 20th century, including local businesses and even large ones like J.C. Penney. I'm not super into buying anything at J.C. Penney. I don't know if I was, but I'm certainly not going to start. Um, there were ads with cartoon blackface characters that would be displayed proudly, and you are free to look these up at your interest, encouraging showgoers to go and shop, which is interesting because these shops probably weren't integrated. And this continued literally into the 1960s. There are people alive who went to these. The Christie minstrels had a kind of particular pattern. From the 1850s on, you would have an interlocutor who was the pompous character. These were sort of stock characters. The end men. So here's the guy in the middle is the interlocutor. And then the end men, Tambo and Bones, would be playing tambourine and Bones, or Bones drums or something. And they would take him down in a series of comic exchanges. There would be specialty acts in what was in a variety section, which was called the olio. there were often not women performers, but there would be white men in drag, called themselves wench impersonators, um, in blackface drag. Uh, and then the afterpiece would often be a satire or burlesque of a popular play. So you would go and see the main minstrel show, and then there would be an afterpiece that would take a popular white play or a play that would commonly be performed with white actors and make it quote unquote comic by doing it in blackface. Um, Hopefully, my distaste is making its way to you. The afterpiece of Othello, uh, or Othello was a frequent afterpiece. So, the blackness of Othello as a way into minstrelsy, denying Othello Shakespeare's language in favor of racist caricatures, subjugating black culture in relation to high art. Sorry, coming back. And, even the small entries of blackness into elite art are mocked. It's horrible. In case you were wondering, yes, people said it was racist. Guess how many white people listened? People made money from it. They were going to continue to do it until someone told them not to. And, if you noticed previously, it didn't really disappear completely until the 1960s, the civil rights era. Frederick Douglass wrote against these shows as the filthy scum of white society. Here's a phrase we hear even today: pandering to the corrupt base of their fellow citizens. So, history. James Monroe Trotter, after he was freed, described it as the often malicious caricaturing of an unfortunate race. So these are people very clearly speaking out. And as we spoke about with Uncle Tom's Cabin, this is a way for white audiences to choose exactly what they wanted from black culture: humor, stereotypes, confirmation of white supremacy, theft of art in many ways, and present it to one another with their own writers, their own actors, and their own takes. And so, one question for discussion: how has this persisted over time? When do black artists get to tell their own stories? This is, I don't have many images at all. Obviously, you can feel free to pursue at your pleasure. This is sort of from a distance. And you'll see just how big a deal these shows were. These were called the Mastodon minstrels, which is an odd term, but mastodon meant like mammoth, like the woolly mammoth was also called a mastodon. So I think it just means huge show. And, these are white actors in blackface, and it's just a massive spectacle. The Euclid Avenue Opera House was in Cleveland, Ohio. I looked it up. And this, played for an entire week. It was a 2,000-seat theater. And so this is thousands of people going to see this show. At the same time all of this is happening, one thing we've heard a lot about, at least in terms of heard the word, is vaudeville. And what vaudeville was kind of, as I said, variety stages, was like a variety show. So we have separate acts, they're unrelated, they're joined together in an evening's entertainment, different skits. The beginnings were working class, linked to the sex trade. So if you're a sex worker, you might be in the audience. There were concerns with the reputation of vaudeville houses. Presumably somebody'd go to the vaudeville act, pick up a sex worker, and, maybe that was bad, maybe that was good, who knows. Eventually they were cleaned up and diversified, and eventually crept up to attract middle-class patrons, less vulgar. There was name brand talent: Lillian Russell, the Four Cohans, Weber and Fields. These aren't people we see today because they've all been dead for a long time. It endures in shows like The Muppet Show, which you can see on Disney Plus now, The Circus, Saturday Night Live, There's representations of vaudeville in Sarah Waters' novel, Tipping the Velvet, which is about lesbian cross-dressing performers in Victorian England. If you want a novel to read, highly recommended. There were chains of vaudeville houses. If you've ever been to a Pantages theater, that is a remnant of a vaudeville chain. And they would circulate talented players around and send them on tour to maximize profits and create value for patrons. Harrigan and Hart were two well-known variety performers from New York who appealed to immigrant communities. And they wrote unique plays with immigration groups from New York. Jewish characters, Italian characters, Irish characters. This eventually became something middle-class audiences really enjoyed. One of the most famous ones was called, and this is just weird, but hear me out, the Mulligan Guard Ball. So this is basically about an Irish cast of characters. It was a parody of social clubs. So like the club was called the Mulligan Guard, and they'd have like various things happen to them. But it had over 100 performances. There were related plays, including a Christmas one, a surprise, a wedding. I don't know what the chowder one is. And they kept using the same actors over and over again. So if you think about it, it's kind of like a sitcom with singing. You know, people start to like the characters in one situation, and then they'd go and see a play with a different situation and the same characters. Sometimes there's a focus on race, where a black social club wants to have an event in the same building and there's conflict. Irish boy elopes with German girl, people are bothered, etc. Weber and Fields, the sort of, helped innovate the comedy duo. They were Jewish, but they played German immigrants. Another innovation here, where you have humor that is generated from one person being tall and thin and one person being short and heavyset. They were innovators in burlesque, which it originally means a parody or a send-up or a sexy show. But now, of course, burlesque is kind of the sexy show. So one example of burlesque is where you have a famous ballerina who came to New York to dance in La Tarantula. And so the male performer from, Weber and Fields decided to do La Mosquito. A lot of physical comedy, too. There was a show called Fiddle-Dee-Dee, which had white characters singing racist dialect songs, and white people came to see it. We're going to not spend time on that. Williams and Walker, the biggest name black comedians in vaudeville. And they had to bill themselves as authentically black to separate themselves from blackface performers. They still performed in blackface themselves, partly because that was expected and partly because it was a way to kind of give a mask to the performance, rather than say this is authentically what blackness is. They were types of characters. Walker was the dandy, who was a smooth talker and always has some kind of scheme going on. Williams, unlucky and not super smart and kind of the butt of some jokes. I mean, this is a comedy duo type. And they were together for 16 years. And importantly, they gave a lot of black actors, talent, work. In Dahomey is the first full-length, all-black musical to play Broadway, and this is by Williams and Walker. There were racially diverse audiences. The plot is where rich black businessmen in Boston are trying to use less fortunate black Americans to colonize Africa. They hire detectives, and that's Williams and Walker. There they are in this picture. They are black actors in blackface. Again, this is as much blackface as I think you're going to see in this class, unless you seek it out. But I mean, I figure for black actors, it's important to show them as people. Swing Along was an example of the music from the show. Definitely make sure you give it a listen. And in general, I'm going to leave us with a final question. Sometimes it's hard to know how brilliant some of these comics were because we don't have evidence. So think about what other kinds of evidence are missing from these early shows and think about what you would like to know. Thank you.